Welcome to the 39th annual Kitsap Leadership Prayer Breakfast. Give yourselves a hand for being here this morning. I know you enjoyed an amazing morning to see all of you. My name is Ken Riley, and I will be leading us through the program at the Master of Ceremony this morning. And I'm excited to be here. I just think this is a timely time for us to gather, a timely time for us to represent unity and also pray and know that there is power in prayer. 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, "If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray, seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will heal from heaven and I will forgive their sins and heal their land." 1 Thessalonians 5:16 and 18 says, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you." James 5:16 says, "Confess your sins to one another and pray for one another, that you will be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous person availeth much." That's the spirit in which we gather today, to know that there is power in prayer, and we believe in a God who heals, a God who delivers, a God who unites, and a God who points us to his love, grace, and mercy.
So what I wanted to talk about today was my own observations and a lot of the really cutting-edge neuroscience and understanding the relationship between the mind and the brain. And what I found over my career is that relationship is very nicely described by a Christian faith. That is, that there's no real dichotomy between the way science looks at the human mind and the human brain and the way our Christian faith shows us they work. So thank you all for having me. My own story is that I was raised in an agnostic household, and I never had any hostility to Christianity. I always thought Christians were wonderful people. I just didn't believe it was true. Over my career and over a lot of personal experiences, including a Damascus Road experience, I'll be happy to speak about it sometime, I came to Christ about 25 years ago. And I've made it a point to convey to people that the medical and neuroscientific understanding of the way the brain and the mind work is very much the way that our Christian faith teaches us that our soul works. So I went to medical school at Columbia University. I trained in neurosurgery at the University of Miami. And I fell in love in medical school with neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. I thought that if I understood how the brain worked, I would understand what it was to be human. I would understand something deep and profound about human nature and about who I was. And so I eagerly began practicing neurosurgery, trying to learn more and more about what it meant to be human. But I encountered patients that challenged what I had learned in the textbooks. This is a young girl, her name is Cindy. It's not her real name, but she's a real patient. The picture on your right is a normal brain of a patient in MRI. This is a picture of Cindy's brain in MRI. And Cindy was born missing about 2/3 or 3/4 of her brain. At birth, I told her family that I didn't think she was going to do too well. Obviously, this is a severe disability. And as she grew up, she's been perfectly normal. In fact, she's quite bright, actually. She's now in her mid-20s, a very accomplished young lady. Her mom says that she's too smart for her own good. And she's missing a major part of her brain. That wasn't in any of my textbooks. None of these sort of materialist textbooks that tell how the brain and mind work can even begin to describe that. The next patient is Joshua, a little boy who was missing, again, about 2/3 of his brain. When he was born, the intensive care unit was so pessimistic about his outcome that they told his mother to stop feeding him, that his life wouldn't be worthwhile. My team caught wind of that process. They didn't include us in that decision making. So I reversed that decision and fed him. He graduated from high school recently, a perfectly normal young man. He loves football and loves sports, and missing a great part of his brain. This is Nicholas. Nicholas is a little boy was born with hydranencephaly. That black there is water inside his skull. The picture on your right there is of a normal brain. Nicholas is missing all of his brain from his brainstem up. He has no brain hemispheres at all. This was the way he was born. The condition was called hydranencephaly. And Nicholas is quite handicapped. He has cerebral palsy. But he's fully conscious and alert and smiles and loves his family and is very friendly to people visiting him and so on. And by all current neuroscientific models of how the brain relates to the mind, Nicholas should be in a coma because he doesn't have brain hemispheres, he doesn't have cerebral cortex. But he's awake and alert and functions in many ways okay. I particularly was shocked by the dichotomy between what real life neurosurgery and science shows us about the brain and mind and what the textbooks show us. A number of years ago, I was doing an awake craniotomy on a woman who had a left frontal lobe brain tumor. And you can do neurosurgery on people while they're awake. It doesn't hurt. We give lidocaine or novocaine to the scalp. The brain itself feels no pain. And we give them a sedative. And the reason we would do it awake is to map the surface of the brain, to find out the vital areas that we have to be careful to protect during the surgery. And this tumor was right next to the part of the brain that controlled her speech, so I had to make sure that it didn't damage the speech area as I was operating. So I had a 3 or 4 hour conversation with her under the surgical drapes as we're operating, again, making sure that her speech was still okay. And we talked about all kinds of things, talked about the weather, about the hospital food, about her family. As I was taking out a major part of her left frontal lobe to get the tumor out, and the tumor came out, it was a benign tumor, she made a really good recovery. And I left the operating room in a state of shock that I had just removed a major part of what the textbook said was a critical region of this woman's brain. And she's perfectly normal during the process and perfectly normal after the process. So there was something about the way the mind works that connects to the brain in a way that's different from what the textbook said. I began searching the medical literature, and I found that I wasn't the first neurosurgeon to notice this. Wilder Penfield was a pioneer in understanding the mind-brain relationship. He was a neurosurgeon in Montreal back in the mid-20th century. And he really pioneered a lot of modern neurosurgical techniques. And he was a great neuroscientist. If you've seen in textbooks in school pictures of a homunculus, which is a little man, it shows all that, shows how the brain is laid out like a map on the surface. That was from Penfield's work. So Penfield was fascinated by seizures. And he noticed something that I've noticed too that is a really amazing thing. Sometimes seizures knock people out. You have a generalized seizure, you fall down, you go unconscious, but not always. There are seizures that leave people awake. They're called partial complex seizures. They're fairly common. And people can have, their arm can twitch, or they can feel tingling on their skin, or they can see flashes of light, or they can have memories. Sometimes they have strong emotions. There are people who drive cars while they're having a seizure, and drive them well. They'll start having the seizure, and 10 miles down the road, the seizure will stop, and they've driven the car just fine. So you can do things awake while you're having a seizure. And Penfield noticed that when he studied all the history of seizures, and studied his own patients, that people who are having seizures and are awake do one of 4 things. They'll have a movement that they can't control. They'll have a sensation they can't control. They'll have a memory that comes to them recurrently, or they'll have an emotion that comes to them recurrently. But what they don't have, ever, is what we're doing here. They have no rational thought. There are no logic seizures. There are no seizures that make you think about the mind-brain relationship. There are no seizures about calculus. There are no mathematics seizures. Never been reported. I estimated there have been 250 million seizures in human beings over the past 200 years in the medical literature. Not a single one has ever involved any kind of abstract rational thought. Penfield noticed the same thing. So I said, why not? If seizures will make you do all kinds of things from your brain, why is an entire category of thought never come from a seizure? And he said the obvious explanation would be is that thinking didn't come from the brain. He said maybe it's as if we have spiritual souls. And part of our spirit isn't from the brain. Penfield started his career out as a materialist and an atheist, and ended his career as a Christian and a dualist. He then carried his research further by doing what I had been doing awake brain surgery, only he did it on 1,100 patients over a period of 40 years, to map their brains, to find out what parts of the brain had to be protected in tumor surgery, what parts could be safely removed. And he found exactly the same thing. When he would stimulate the brain, he could stimulate movement, he could stimulate emotions, he could stimulate sensations, he could stimulate memories. But he could never stimulate abstract thought. He could never stimulate a spot in a person to say, oh, 1 + 1 is 2. Or a person to say, gee, I wonder about the mind-brain relationship. So he said there was a part of the mind that was separate from the brain. He said that's the human spirit. I have debated this with a number of neuroscientists, and I've challenged them to show me one bit of evidence in neuroscience, in the history of neuroscience, that you can evoke by stimulating the brain things that we would call spiritual things. Abstract thought, reason, thinking about God. No one has been able to take up the challenge. That's never been evoked from the brain itself. So Penfield had asked this question at the beginning of his research. And the question he asked is, does the brain explain the mind completely? Which is what I thought when I started out. You study the brain, you learn the brain well enough that you know everything there is to know about the mind. And Penfield concluded his research in a book called Mystery of the Mind, which is available on Amazon if you want to read it. It's a great book. And he concluded that the brain does not explain the mind completely. There's something in the mind, the human spirit, that is not from the brain. The second line of evidence beyond Penfield's work, or actually the third, and beyond my own experience, is research on split brains. There's a kind of an operation called a corpus callosotomy, also called split brain surgery, that can be done for people who have intractable seizures. People who have seizures, there are people who have 30 or 40 seizures a day, generalized seizures, and sometimes medication doesn't work. What's found is that there is a large bundle of fibers between the two hemispheres of the brain. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. And it's called the corpus callosum. And that connects. There are 200 million axons in that bundle of fibers. And if a little tiny seizure begins in one side, with one hemisphere, it can spread across those fibers and reach the whole brain and cause a huge seizure. In the 1940s, it was found that you could cut that bundle of fibers and stop those seizures. So you could help this small category of patients who are having these terrible seizures. So the surgery's been done extensively. Thousands of people have had this operation. I've done the operation. It works very well. And Roger Sperry is a neuroscientist who realized that when you cut the hemispheres apart, you could study what each hemisphere does on its own in a way, using some clever techniques. So he did that and won the Nobel Prize for it. But what he noticed also, and what I've noticed, is what I think is the most remarkable thing about this. It's not so much that the hemispheres have slightly different functions, which they do, but they're very subtle. And when you cut someone's brain in half, they are not perceptibly different. That is, I could have had my brain cut in half a year ago, and you couldn't tell. You can't tell. The person can't tell. Post-operatively, you ask them, how do you feel? If I feel fine. You feel like two people? No. So, Sperry won the Nobel Prize for studying the differences, which were very subtle differences. Whether the right hemisphere seems to be concerned with spatial relationships, left hemisphere is usually involved with speech. But these are subtle things. And I think that the real Nobel Prize-winning stuff is the realization that nothing happened except that. It'd be as if you took your laptop, took a chainsaw, cut it in half, and we're fine. I can tell you there's something about your laptop that you don't yet understand. So the research that I think is most fascinating about this, and Sperry's work has been carried on by a number of people. Alice Cronin-Golub at MIT has looked very carefully at these patients who've had the split brain surgery. And she has done hundreds of experiments with these people. And what she does is very clever. She, using visual fields, you can present a picture to one brain hemisphere or the other brain hemisphere, and they're disconnected, so you can study the individual hemisphere. And this is the kind of thing that gives me chills. I've known about this research for years, and I still get chills thinking about it. To one hemisphere, she would present, for example, a picture of a violin. To the other hemisphere, she would present 3 pictures. One of an artist's palette, one of a toilet plunger, and one of a stethoscope. And she would ask the patients, for the one picture, which of the 3 pictures is conceptually connected to the one? And people with split brain, people who have that split brain can tell it's easy. People with split brain can tell just as easily. And they'll say, well, the artist's palette, because the violin and the artist's palette are both kinds of art. But you have to remember that these people have split brains. So one brain hemisphere sees the violin, the other brain hemisphere sees the artist's palette. No part of their brain sees both things. So how can they make a conceptual connection between 2 things using their brain when nothing in their brain sees the violin and the artist's palette? But they can't do it easily. What it means is that the agency they're using to make the connection isn't in the brain. It's the human spirit. And this experiment lays the human spirit out so you can see it clearly. There are people who have conjoined brains. It's very rare. They are what in the past we've called Siamese twins. 2 little girls, Tatiana and Krista Hogan in Canada, were born joined at the head, and they share significant parts of their brains. And it's fascinating. They can see out of each other's eyes. One girl closes her eyes, the other child can see. They can feel each other's skin. There's actually a video of mom having both girls with their eyes closed, touches one girl's hand, and both girls know that the hand is being touched. They share control to some extent of their arms and legs. And they actually can share memories, and they share emotions often. But, very interestingly, they're completely different people. They have different personalities, different likes and dislikes. They like different foods, they like different music. They're quite distinct, different people. So what this shows is that there are things that the brain does that you can share if you're connected to somebody else. But there are other things in our soul and our spirit that can't be shared because they're not in the brain. You can't share your spirit in the same way you share memories. Wilder Penfield also did some fascinating work on free will. And he did a fascinating experiment with these 1,100 patients. They were under the surgical drapes, so they couldn't see anything. They were awake. He was stimulating the brain. And he told them at the beginning of the operation, I want you, every 15 or 20 minutes to just raise your right arm for me, under the drapes, just raise your arm. And he said, I'm going to make you raise your arm occasionally also by stimulating the part of your brain that controls your right arm. And when your right arm goes up, I want you to tell me, did you do it or did I do it? And he did hundreds of thousands of stimulations of arms being raised and so on. The patients always got it right. They always knew when he made them raise their arm and when they made them. So Penfield said, I couldn't find a free will center in the brain. I couldn't simulate the free will where they would mistakenly think they did. So he said, free will doesn't come from the brain. Free will is a spiritual power of the soul, the power to choose. It's not from the brain. There's a fascinating phenomenon called paradoxical lucidity that many people have seen in their families. And I have a colleague at Stony Brook, Stephen Post, who's a medical ethicist, who's a dear friend and a devout Christian. And he's written a very good book on this, entitled Dignity for Deeply Forgetful People. And what paradoxical lucidity is people who are in the advanced stages of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, rather frequently will have episodes where they suddenly become their old self again. And usually lasts 15, 20 minutes. I co-authored a book recently, and my co-author, Denise O'Leary's father, had this happen. You walk into their room, they're normally not non-communicative, and suddenly they're what they were 30 years before. Last for a short time, and then they go back to their state. And sometimes it happens just before death. Not always, but sometimes it's called terminal lucidity, but sometimes it just happens out of the blue. And what it shows us is that in people who have the advanced stages of Alzheimer's, they're still there. They're not lost. Mm-hmm. So the brain does many things, and Alzheimer's is a disease of the brain. It's not a disease of the spirit. The spirit is still there. Adrian Owen is a neuroscientist, was at Cambridge, I think he's now at Indiana University, who's done some of the most fascinating work on consciousness in this century. And what he did is he wanted to know people who have the most severe form of brain injury, which is called persistent vegetative state. In a sense, it's the deepest level of coma. It's the level of coma that Terry Schiavo was in. You recall that thing like 25 years ago. It's been believed by the medical profession that people in the deepest level of coma, who show no responses to tending, they just don't even have a mind. They're basically just a body, a shell, without any internal mind. So he wanted to investigate that, because obviously when you have such severe brain injury, you have difficulty communicating. So how do you know they don't have a mind if they can't talk or they can't write? So he took patients who had very severe brain injuries, who were diagnosed reliably in persistent vegetative state, put them in an MRI machine. There's a kind of MRI called functional MRI imaging that shows when the brain is working and people are thinking, there are patterns that lights up. And even a very damaged brain can show patterns of lighting up. And he asked the people in coma, think of walking across the room, or think about playing tennis, or think about your family. And a lot of the people, their brains lit up in patterns that looked like they were in fact responding to his request. He took normal people, put them in the machine, asked the same questions, and he got the same patterns, implying that they were thinking relatively normal. Then he did something very clever. He wanted to make sure that what he was seeing on the MRI machine represented actual understanding, that it wasn't just like a response to the noise coming in the ears. So he scrambled the words. So instead of imagining walking across a room, he would say room, across, walking, imagine room. So it didn't make any sense, and the brains went silent. So when he spoke gibberish, brains were silent. When it made sense. So he's at a point now where about 40% of people in persistent vegetative state, you can communicate with them. You can ask them how they're feeling, they can tell you about their families. There are people who can do math in the deepest stages of coma. So what it again shows is that there's this disconnect between the human spirit and the human brain. Obviously they interact on a fairly high level, but not the same thing. Perhaps the most dramatic examples of disconnects between the spirit and brain is near-death experiences. And the most famous near-death experience was a woman named Pam Reynolds. She was a woman in her mid-30s who was found to have a basilar artery aneurysm. That X-ray picture on the upper right there with the arrow was a huge ballooned blood vessel at the base of her brain that was about to burst, and it needed to be fixed. The problem is that the blood vessel it's on is a critical blood vessel, and you can't operate on it without causing massive brain damage. So Dr. Robert Spetzler was sort of the world's expert on this. He worked in Phoenix, and he had an operation called the standstill procedure. And standstill procedure was a radical procedure where he brought Ms. Reynolds into the operating room, put her under general anesthesia, cooled her body temperature down to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which protected her brain. He then put her on a heart-lung machine and then stopped her heart, so she was clinically dead. He then tipped the operating table up, drained the blood out of her brain so he could work on the aneurysm, which was full of blood. He had to get the blood out of it. Mm-hmm. And then he fixed the aneurysm and then reversed the process and woke her up. And she did fine. She did very, very well, made excellent recovery. In the recovery room, she told him that it was a fascinating operation because she watched it. So I know Bob Spencer, and he was like, how you couldn't have watched it. I mean, I drained the blood out of your brain and you were dead. And she was also under surgical drapes. Had she even been conscious that time, she couldn't have seen anything. People don't see things when they're under drapes. And she had devices in her ears that were sending very loud clicks, about 100 decibel clicks, which is like a loud hairdryer, into her ears to stimulate her brain so they could document that her brain was dead. So she couldn't have heard naturally anyway. So she then recited to him his conversations that he had during the surgery. And then she told him what the instruments that he was using looked like. And then she told him which doctors were in the room. There were like 30 different doctors who were in and out of the room, which ones had been there, and what their voices sounded like. So she said that when her heart stopped, she felt herself pop out of her body. She said there was a tone. She was a musician. She said it was like a natural D. And so I don't know what natural D is, but she said it was like a hum. And she popped out of her body and floated up to the ceiling and went around watching the operation. And then she saw a tunnel, and she said she felt she was being drawn down the tunnel. She said it was a very pleasant feeling. It wasn't a feeling it wasn't a frightening feeling. It was a beautiful feeling. She was down the tunnel to this beautiful world at the other end of the tunnel. She saw her relatives and grandparents who had predeceased her. And she said she wanted to stay there. It was so pretty. And they said, no, she had to go back. She had 3 kids to raise. So she went back down the tunnel, went back into her body. She said it was a very unpleasant feeling to go back into the body. In fact, she said she felt sorry for the body. It just looked so terrible. And she said that it was like jumping into ice water, which is true. It was 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So she wrote a book. This has been on television. And the remarkable thing about this near-death experience was that it was completely monitored. That is that they knew she was brain dead. They deliberately made her brain dead. They documented there was no brain activity. There wasn't even any blood in her brain. And she saw it. So I've debated near-death experiences with people who don't believe that they're real, and I challenge them with what I call the Pam Reynolds challenge. That is that, and there are probably 30 different explanations that materialists have offered for how this, maybe she was having a seizure, maybe this was from the drugs, something like that doesn't explain it. So I think when you're thinking about near-death experiences, there are 4 characteristics of the experiences that clearly point to their reality and clearly say that it cannot be because of seizures or hallucinations or drugs or any of that stuff. The first is that people who have near-death experiences tend to have clear, coherent, hyper-real experiences. These experiences are more beautiful and more real than everyday life. It's like we live in a shadow world, but the real world is a much, much different world. That's not what happens on drugs. It's not what happens if your brain doesn't have enough oxygen. Seeing thousands of people's brains didn't have enough oxygen, the world doesn't get better. They also often will have life reviews where they'll see their entire life of the good things they've done, sometimes the bad things they've done. The second characteristic is that they have accurate out-of-body experiences, like Pam Reynolds said. There are thousands of reports in the medical literature, scientific reports, people having near-death experiences where they see things in the room that they could not have seen, where they're not some sort of spiritual experience. They'll see serial numbers on the tops of cabinets that they couldn't have seen where they were from. There's a famous example of a man who had a cardiac arrest, and during the arrest they removed his dentures so they could intubate him and treat him. And the nurse in the room just put the dentures in a cabinet in the corner of the room to save them. So after he was resuscitated, and he was in the intensive care unit, and nobody could find his dentures, and the nurse forgot that she had put them in the cabinet. So when he asked where his dentures were, they said, well, we can't find them because, hey, they're in the cabinet in that drawer. They were put in the cabinet when he was dead, and he knew where they were because he saw her do it. The third characteristic of near-death experiences that I find absolutely fascinating is that, the tunnel experience, we all know about the tunnel. You get to the tunnel, and on the other end are friends and relatives. And people see a lot of friends and relatives. There has never been a report in medical history of seeing a living person at the other end of the tunnel. Everybody sees in near-death experiences is dead. Now, if this was just a hallucination, if this was just wishful thinking, you might want to see your mom at the other end of the tunnel in this terrible time, and your mom might still be alive. But if your mom isn't dead, you don't see her. They're in a different realm, seeing people who are dead. And there are situations, a number of reports, where you see someone at the other end of the tunnel who you didn't know was dead. There have been several examples of people being in car accidents with a car full of people. And different people are taken to different hospitals. And a person will have a near-death experience from that car accident where they see at the other end of the tunnel the other people in the car who died, but not the people who lived. And they didn't know who died or who lived. The fourth characteristic of near-death experiences that points to their reality is that they tend to be transformative. That is that very, very often people who've had near-death experiences are very different people afterwards. And it's been studied, the transformative nature is much more dramatic in people who've had near-death experiences than people who just died and then resuscitated and didn't have a near-death experience. So there's something, in fact, most people lose their fear of death. They say that what's on the other side is so beautiful. So much of the scientific community still doubts the reality of near-death experiences, but the evidence supporting their reality, I think, is overwhelming. And were it not for the materialist bias against spiritual things, science would say, of course these are real, because the evidence says they're real. So Wilder Penfield, going back to a gentleman we talked about at the beginning, started out as an atheist and a materialist. He ended his career as a deeply spiritual man, much the same as my own journey. And he commented in his book, Mystery of the Mind, that the mind must be viewed as a basic element in itself. What he means by that is the spirit. That what a thrill it is to discover that the scientist, too, can legitimately believe in the existence of the spirit. In fact, if he's a good scientist, he believes in the existence of the spirit, because that's what the science says. Frequently asked questions, things that people frequently ask about this. What about Phineas Gage? I would imagine a number of people here have heard of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railway worker in the 19th century who was injured by an iron spike. It was an explosion. The spike was driven through his brain. And before the explosion, and he recovered. He survived. Before the explosion, he was a church-going man, fairly good Christian. After the explosion, he was still a pretty decent guy, but he lived a somewhat more libertarian life, but not as dramatic as it's often said in popular culture. And one of the conclusions that materialists have drawn from this is that, well, hey, that proves the brain controls the mind, and there's a personality change. But yes, people's personalities can change from brain damage, there's no question about it. But Gage's change was an emotional change, and it changed sort of his emotional tone. And Wilder Penfield, in his work on seizures and work on brain stimulation, pointed out, yes, emotions do come from the brain, there's no question about it. So there's Phineas Gage's experience does not negate the independence of the spirit from the brain. Of course, if you have brain damage, it can affect the way you interact with the world, but it doesn't affect everything. Is the mind a kind of a computation? A lot of the modern models of the mind that neuroscientists use say that one of the common ones is that the brain is the hardware and the mind is the software. And the mind is not a computation. And the reason it's not a computation is that if you think about it, every thought that you have is about something. And it's called intentionality in philosophical literature. So you can think about your family, you can think about justice, you can think about Washington, D.C. There's always an about in a thought. Whereas physical states of things, like the way your brain is never about anything. It's just the state of your brain. So mental processes are always directed at something, at a thought. Physical processes are not inherently directed at things like that. In fact, that's what makes computation so valuable. If you're typing an essay on a word processor, the word processor doesn't care about your opinion in the essay. You can type an essay saying, I believe the mind is separate from the brain. Or you can type an essay saying, I believe the mind is the same thing as the brain. And the word processor will type both essays just fine. Computation is blind to meaning. Computation has no insight into meaning. It's just a mechanical process, electrons zinging around. A mental state always has meaning. So not only is the mind not computation, it's the opposite of computation. So you're not a computer. You can model the way your brain works as if it were a computer. And sometimes models can be helpful in doing research. That doesn't mean that you're a computer. We are not unique computers. In some sense, we're unique computers. Because we have meaning, and computers don't have meaning. Is AI conscious? Right, that's a hot topic. Can artificial intelligence achieve consciousness? When you're dealing with AI, are you dealing with a conscious entity? A way of looking at that is to ask yourself, I love the little Casio watch, best watch ever made. It tells perfect time and lasts forever, and it costs $20. And when I look at the time on my Casio watch doesn't know what time it is. I don't know what time it is. My watch doesn't know. My watch doesn't know anything. It's just a watch. Now, you might say, but if you had a smartwatch, it would know what time it is. But of course, your smartwatch doesn't know what time it is. Your smartwatch helps you know what time it is and helps you do a lot of things, but it doesn't know what time it is. AI doesn't know what time it is. AI is just a really, really fancy Casio watch. And you can take a stadium full of Casio watches, and they still don't know what time it is. So AI, in some sense, is mass plagiarism. What AI does is it searches the internet, finds stuff, and feeds it to you. But everything on the internet is what we put into it. It just copies us. So AI is us. Literally. It's just a tool. And it's not conscious. Did the mind evolve? Can the mind evolve? The answer, I think, is clearly no, and for obvious reasons. I don't believe that Darwinian mechanisms really can explain anything important about life. I think it's a nonsensical theory. I think intelligent design explains life, explains it beautifully. But even if a Darwinian mechanism could evolve something that's meaningful, the human soul has a spiritual component to it. And Darwinian processes only work on physical things. They don't work on spiritual things. So our spiritual soul is created by God at conception. And Darwinism has nothing to do with it. It can't, by its very nature, have anything to do with it. So no, the mind cannot evolve. So how can we understand this mind-brain stuff? How do you get into this a little deeper? I've kind of shown, I think, that neuroscience supports very much the view that we have spiritual souls. And Thomas Aquinas, following Aristotle, pointed out, and I think he's quite right, that the soul is simply the stuff that makes us alive. The soul is not spooky. It's not this ghosty thing that kind of comes out of us and it's kind of translucent and so on. It's just what we do that makes us alive. The soul is the sum of things in a living person that's different from a dead person. So the fact that I'm talking, that I'm seeing, that I'm thinking, that my heart is beating, that my arms are moving, is stuff that I wouldn't do when I'm dead. So all these things are my soul. So soul is just what animates a body. And human beings have a rational soul. Now, animals have souls, and plants have souls. It's just what makes them alive. But our souls are rational, meaning that we can think spiritual things. We can think abstractly. We can think about God. We can think about mathematics, and calculus, and logic. And we have free will. As Penfield pointed out, our will doesn't come from our brain. We can choose. So human beings have a special kind of soul, a rational soul. So what is the soul? besides what animates the body? Well, with our soul, we know things, we love, and we act. And our soul animates us and makes us alive. A soul has no parts. That is, that you can't, for example, cut your soul with a knife, and you put your intellect in one room and you go into the other room. It doesn't work that way. You can do that kind of thing with the body, but you can't do it with the soul. A soul has no location, in a sense. You could say your soul is in your body, but a spiritual thing isn't really located somewhere. It's not a physical thing. It acts in a location, but isn't necessarily located. The soul is not in time either. That is, that a spiritual thing isn't really in time. Physical things are in time, and it connects physically, but the soul itself isn't in time. For example, there's no perception of time in near-death experiences. You can't say, oh, gee, I'm having a near-death experience, and in heaven right now it's 8:26. And the soul abides, meaning the soul, we'll see, the soul is not the kind of thing that can die. So what is the soul? The soul is the spirit. Our soul is a spirit. Everything that I just described, souls that know, that love, that abide, that have no location, that are outside of time, that abide, that's what a spirit is. We are the only physical creatures in God's creation who have spiritual souls. Just like angels have spirits, but they're not bodies. And God is an infinite spirit. We are a very finite spirit attached to a body, but we are spiritual, and our soul is a spirit. And the science backs that up. In a way, we are a paradigm of all creation, if you think about it. We're the only part of God's creation that has everything. We're spirit, we're physical, we're a living thing, we're mineral. We've got calcium and magnesium and so on. All of God's creation is embodied in human beings. And the way that we are created in His image is our spiritual soul. So is the soul immortal? Now, what I've described here may hint at immortality. But that's a big question. So we accept we have spiritual souls. Great. But does it blink out at the moment of death? Near-death experiences kind of imply that it doesn't, but is there more solid reason behind that? It turns out there is. Can a spirit die? Spirits can certainly live, but can a spirit die? A body can die. So what does it mean to die? Let's say that my mouse actually did die. So let's say my mouse died even more. My mouse died even more. And how would this mouse die? Well, the mouse would die if it were melted down into its component molecules and then spread around. But everything inside this mouse would still exist after it's melted down. Same for any physical object. It's podium. You could reduce it to sawdust. The sawdust wouldn't disappear. So what happens is the organization of a physical thing breaks down. So life is the integration of matter, the way matter goes together, and death is a disintegration of matter. So when something physical dies, its integration, its form, falls apart, and it just goes into its component parts. So the body can break down and disintegrate, and it certainly does at death. But how can the soul, that is our spirit, disintegrate? Our spirit doesn't have parts. This can break down because it's made of molecules that can break apart. Our spirit isn't made of molecules. So how's it die? How's it possible for a spirit to die? And a way to think about that is imagine the number 8 instantiated in two ways. One way is written on a piece of paper. The other way is the number of 8, or is the number 8 as the number 8 that mathematicians think about. You can kill, in a sense, the number 8 on a piece of paper. You can put it in a fireplace, and it'll burn up and become dust. But how can the conceptual number 8 die? That's like a spirit. I mean, you're not going to hear from the mathematics department at the local college that we were sad to announce that number 8 passed away today. So we're going to count from 7 to 9. So Immaterial spiritual things cannot die in the way a body dies. They're naturally immortal. We are naturally immortal in our spirit. So a human soul cannot disintegrate. We can't be reduced to dust in our spirit. We can and are reduced to dust in our body. Your spiritual soul has no off switch. There's no off switch on our spirit. Our body has an off switch. Spirit does not. So the human soul is immortal logically, as well as the evidence and as well as our faith. The faith is the most important part. But the logic supports that viewpoint, and the neuroscience supports that viewpoint. Question I've always had, and bugged me until I think I see why. When people report near-death experiences, they report beautiful scenery. On the other side of the tunnel is such that you never want to come back. But they've got no eyes. You know, their eyes are in that dead body. So what are they seeing with? How do you see colors without eyes? So we can see on the other end of the tunnel much better than we see now. How can you see much better without eyes? So it kind of bugged me. You know, it didn't seem to make sense. So it bugged Thomas Aquinas also. And practically anything that bugs you nowadays has been bugged for thousands of years. People thought about this. So Aquinas had an analogy I think is quite beautiful. He said that life in this world is like living in a cathedral at night. And it's lit by torches. And you walk around the cathedral, and there's some pretty things. You know, the torches are glowing. You look at the windows, this is what they look like, kind of gray. And so you can see stuff, but you're in this gray world, this lit world. And your death is just before dawn when you die. But at dawn, you see light not from inside the cathedral by torches. You see light from outside coming in. You see divine light. So what people are seeing, I think, in near-death experiences, is this beautiful world. It's God's light. It's divine light. It's a different way of seeing. It doesn't require eyes. And it's a better way of seeing. It's a beautiful way of seeing. It's what the mystics see. And it's real. It's divine light coming in through the windows of the cathedral, not this flickering lamp inside the cathedral. So faith, logic, and neuroscience all point to the same reality. We have spiritual, immortal souls. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Egnor. Beautiful presentation. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I don't know about you. I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? I'm going to incorporate that into my Sunday message. And the Holy Spirit said, no, you're not. You don't stay in your lane. You have not done the work. So Romans 12, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. That's as far as I'll go.
Yeah.
And can we give it up for him again? What a wonderful... conclusion of our time, Dr. Egnor will be at the table there with the Discovery Institute. There's some literature available. Certainly you can continue to ask more questions and engage, purchase the book, and I think that was very mind-blowing. No pun intended, but that was very mind-blowing. Thank you so much for that. And so now we will have our benediction. Will come now as the chaplain comes. Let's give it up for him. We have Chaplain Aaron, Robert, Command Chaplain. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Let us pray. Gracious Lord, as this breakfast concludes, we are grateful for the nourishment we have received, both physically and spiritually. We thank you for our speaker's words, which have illuminated the beauty and complexity of your creation. Empower us to be stewards of your gifts, to use our talents and resources to make a positive impact on the world around us and in the Kitsap Peninsula. May we carry the spirit of this gathering into our homes, our workplaces, and our community. Go before us, Lord, and guide our steps. Help us to be instruments of your peace, to build bridges of understanding, and to create a more just and divine world. May we depart from this place with a renewed sense of wonder at the majesty of your design. Infuse us with the courage to defend truth, the humility to seek wisdom, and the unwavering commitment to reflect your light in all that we do, so that others may come to know the boundless love and grace offered in Jesus Christ. Amen.
Have a wonderful day. God bless you.